Price moves fast, but it cannot stay there. The April 5th Asia session forms inside the lower half of the prior US session box, still contained within the same structure. The session opens near the lower boundary. Price lifts immediately. It pushes away from the base with visible speed. At first, the move looks clean. Candles extend. Bodies expand. Distance opens from the lower side. For a moment, it feels like separation, but it does not last. The first push reaches toward the session mid. It touches the area. It cannot stay. The candles stop growing. The bodies shrink. The movement stalls before the next level is taken. That is the first failure. Now the structure starts to speak. The lower boundary held, but the upper path did not open. Now price returns. Not instantly, but gradually. First, the upward momentum slows. Then the bodies reduce. Then the pullback begins. Now price drops back toward the lower half. That return matters, because the move traveled. But it did not convert into location. Now the second attempt begins. Price lifts again from the same lower side. It pushes toward the same mid-level. But something changes. The distance is smaller. The first push stretched. The second push shortens. The first push reached and stalled. The second push stalls earlier. Now reaction speed increases. Price touches the same mid-zone. Fails faster. Returns sooner. Now compression begins forming. The upper side is not open. The lower side is not broken. Everything is happening inside the same box. Now the third attempt. Price lifts again. But this time the move is weaker. It does not reach as far. It does not hold as long. It does not create the same space. Now the pattern is visible. Reach, fail, return. Reach again, fail earlier, return faster. Now the upper boundary becomes clearer. Price pushes higher. It approaches the upper edge of the session structure. It touches. It cannot stay. That is critical, because now the entire upper side is confirmed as failure. Now the move down begins. Price drops from the upper area. It moves through mid quickly. It approaches the lower boundary again. At this moment, it looks like continuation, but it fails again. The lower boundary reacts. Price touches. It bounces. But the bounce is weak. Now the lower side shows the same problem. Reaction exists, but continuation does not. Now both sides are active, but neither side opens. This is where compression becomes real. Price moves up. It cannot stay. Price moves down. It cannot continue. Now the structure tightens. The next push-up is smaller. The next failure comes sooner. The next return is faster. Distance shrinks. Now the candles still move, but the space disappears. Now the session starts to feel heavy. A move begins. It looks usable. Then it stalls before distance opens. A drop begins. It looks decisive. Then it reacts before continuation forms. Now the chart offers movement, but removes holding. That is pressure. Now the session box defines execution. Upper boundary equals failure zone. Mid equals collapse zone. Lower boundary equals reaction zone. Now the sequence continues. Price lifts again. It reaches mid. Fails quickly. Returns again. Now the failure is faster than before. Now price drops again. It reaches lower boundary. Reacts quickly, but cannot travel. Now both sides are compressing toward the center. Now mid becomes dominant. Every move returns to it. Every attempt collapses into it. Now repetition builds weight. The more price fails at the top, the heavier the upper boundary becomes. The more price reacts at the bottom, The stronger the lower boundary becomes. Now both sides tighten. Now the next move up. Shorter. Fails earlier. Returns faster. Now the next move down. Quick reaction. Short bounce. Return again. Now the session is no longer expanding. It is folding. Moves stall. Pullbacks deepen. Continuation fails earlier. Now the structure becomes mechanical. Price reaches. Fails. Returns. Again. Price reaches. Fails sooner. Returns faster. Again. Now the distance between attempts shrinks. Now the time between reactions shortens. Now the chart becomes crowded. Movement is visible, but usable space disappears. Now execution pressure increases. If price reaches the upper boundary, it must hold immediately. If not, it returns instantly. If price reaches the lower boundary, it reacts immediately. But that reaction must extend. If not, it collapses again. Now both conditions fail. Now nothing extends. Now everything returns. Now the session ends inside compression. The structure has not changed location. The movement has not created space. Everything that moved has come back. The session forms inside repeated failure. The movement is real. The holding keeps failing. And because of that, the structure becomes heavier. Price moves again, but it cannot stay there. The session forms under the same upper boundary that has already failed. Price lifts from the middle. It pushes toward the prior high. It looks clean again. The candles extend. The move builds. It reaches the same upper area. For a moment, it looks open, but it cannot stay. The movement stalls. The bodies shrink. The push stops growing. Then it slips. Price drops back inside immediately. The move does not hold. The position cannot survive there. Now the return accelerates. Price falls through the middle. It does not pause. It goes straight back down. What looked like continuation turns into collapse. Now the lower side. Price reaches down. It touches the lower boundary. A reaction appears. It looks like support, but it cannot continue. The bounce lifts. Then it stalls early. Then it drops again. Now both sides fail. Up cannot hold. Down cannot continue. Everything returns. Now the second push. Price climbs again. It goes back to the same upper area. But something has changed. It gets there faster, but fails faster. It does not build space. It does not create room. It touches and turns. Now the failure is immediate. Price reaches. Fails. Returns. Now the timing tightens. Before, it stalled. Now it does not stall. It just fails. Now the next drop. Price moves down again. It reaches lower boundary again. Reaction comes again. But the reaction is smaller. It lifts slightly. Then stops. Then collapses again. Now the range shrinks. Now the space disappears. Now the next push-up. Shorter. Faster failure. Immediate return. Now the structure is visible. Every move reaches. None of them stay. Every reaction appears. None of them extend. Now mid becomes dominant. Price returns to mid. It cannot leave again. Every move collapses here. Now execution becomes pressure. A move up starts. It looks usable. It looks clean. But it cannot stay. It returns immediately. A move down starts. It looks decisive. It looks open. But it cannot continue. It reacts immediately. Now nothing survives. Now the sequence repeats faster. Reach. Fail. Return. Reach again. Fail sooner. Return faster. Now the upper side gets heavier. Not from one rejection, from repeated failure. Now the lower side gets stronger. Not from breakout, from repeated interruption. Now both sides close in. Now nothing opens. Now the chart becomes tight. Movement exists, but space does not. Now the next push. Price reaches the upper boundary again. This time, it does not even try. It touches. Fails instantly. Returns immediately. Now the failure is automatic. No hesitation. No pause. No space. Now the drop. Price moves down again. Touches lower side again. Reaction comes again. But it cannot extend. It lifts slightly. Then dies. Now everything compresses. Now the session folds inward. Now every move is shorter. Now every failure is faster. Now every return is immediate. Now the structure is clear. Price can move, but it cannot stay. Price can drop, but it cannot continue. Everything returns. Now the session ends the same way. Not with direction, with failure. Everything that moved came back. Everything that looked open, closed. Everything that looked usable, failed. And because of that, the next session does not open space. It inherits pressure. Price moves again. But now it fails faster. The session forms inside the same compressed range, already tightened by repeated failure. Price opens near mid. It lifts immediately. It moves toward the upper boundary again. It looks like continuation, but it cannot stay. The move reaches the same area. There is no pause. There is no build. It fails instantly. Now the return is immediate. Price drops back inside. It does not stall. It does not hold. It collapses. Now the first shift is visible. Before, it reached and hesitated. Now it reaches and dies. Now the second push. Price lifts again. It tries to move higher. But the distance is shorter. It does not reach as far. It does not hold as long. It fails earlier. Now the structure tightens further. Now execution becomes specific. Price reaches the upper boundary again. This is the line. If it cannot stay above immediately, it returns again. It cannot stay. It drops immediately. Now the failure repeats faster. Now the lower side. Price drops. It reaches the lower boundary. Reaction appears instantly. It lifts, but it cannot continue. The bounce is shallow. The move stops early. It returns again. Now both sides accelerate. Upper fails faster. Lower reacts faster. Mid pulls everything back. Now the structure is collapsing inward. Now the next move. Price pushes up again. It does not even reach the same level. It fails before the boundary. Now the failure happens in advance. Now tolerance is gone. Now the sequence is tight. Reach. Fail. Return. Reach again. Fail sooner. Return faster. Now execution becomes pressure. Now define it clearly. Upper boundary equals failure line. If price cannot stay above, it returns immediately. Lower boundary equals reaction line. If reaction cannot extend, it collapses again. Mid equals collapse zone. Everything returns here. Now the next drop. Price moves down again. It reaches the lower boundary. It reacts. But the move is smaller. It lifts slightly. Then fails again. Now the range shrinks again. Now the space disappears again. Now the next push-up. Shorter. Faster failure. Immediate return. Now nothing survives. Now the compression is no longer slow. It is aggressive. Moves stall immediately. Pullbacks deepen faster. Continuation fails earlier. Now execution becomes strict. A move up must hold instantly. If not, it fails immediately. A move down must continue instantly. If not, it reacts immediately. Now both conditions fail. Now nothing holds. Now repetition accelerates. Reach. Fail. Return. Reach again. Fail faster. Return sooner. Now the session confirms one thing. Not movement. Failure. Price moves again. But now it breaks faster and fails faster. The session forms inside fully compressed structure. Price opens near the lower half. It lifts. It drives toward the upper boundary again. This is the test. If it holds, space opens. If it cannot, everything collapses again. Price reaches the upper boundary. It does not hesitate. It fails instantly. It returns immediately. Now failure is automatic. No pause, no build, no extension. Now the second push. Price lifts again. Shorter, weaker, faster failure. It touches. It fails. It returns. Now the structure is locked. Now define execution clearly. Upper boundary equals invalidation line. If price cannot stay above, it collapses immediately. Now the drop. Price moves down. It reaches the lower boundary. Reaction appears. But again, no continuation. Now define it. Lower boundary equals reaction line. If reaction cannot extend, it fails again. Now the bounce. It lifts slightly, then stops, then drops again. Now the entire range compresses further. Now mid becomes dominant. Everything returns to mid. Everything dies at mid. Now execution becomes tighter. Now include the action frame. If price reaches the upper boundary, it must hold immediately. If not, it collapses back to mid. If price reaches the lower boundary, reaction must extend immediately. If not, it snaps back again. Now both fail. Now nothing survives. Now the repetition accelerates further. Reach. Fail instantly. Return immediately. Reach again. Fail even faster. Return even sooner. Now the chart changes. Moves look strong, but they die instantly. Pullbacks look deep, but they stop early. Continuation fails everywhere. Now the structure is suffocating. Now the session is not expanding. It is collapsing inward. Now introduce the pressure layer. This is where execution breaks most participants. Because movement is visible, but holding is impossible. Now the final push. Price lifts again. It approaches the upper boundary. It touches. It fails immediately. No delay. No space. Now the drop. Price moves down again. It reaches lower boundary again. Reaction appears again. But again, no continuation. Now everything is repeating faster than before. Now nothing opens. Now everything closes. Now the US session does not resolve anything. It intensifies failure. Compression builds. Distance disappears. Reactions accelerate. Now the next session inherits less space, and even less tolerance. Price moves again. But now it meets something new. The session forms at the boundary where compression meets the 120 moving average. Price opens near the lower half. It lifts immediately. It pushes upward with force. It looks different. This move is faster. This move is cleaner. It breaks through prior failure zones. For a moment, it feels like release. but it reaches the 120 line, and it stalls. Now the first friction appears. Price touches the 120. It does not pass smoothly. It hesitates. Then it drops. Now the return is sharper. Price falls back into the prior range. It does not hold above. Now the structure shows something new. It is no longer just boundaries. Now the line above becomes active. Now the next push. Price lifts again. It reaches the same 120 area. It tries to break through, but the move slows again. It touches. It stalls. It fails again. Now failure is not at the boundary. Failure is at the line. Now define the condition. 120 line equals friction line. If price cannot move through, it returns faster. Now the drop. Price falls. It moves through mid faster than before. It reaches the lower boundary again. Reaction appears. But again, no continuation. Now both sides are still failing. But something changes. The top is heavier. The line is pushing back. Now the next lift. Price moves up again, but the distance is shorter. It cannot even reach cleanly. It gets close, then slows, then fails. Now the friction increases. Now define execution pressure. If price reaches the 120 line, it must pass immediately. If not, it returns faster than before. Now the next drop. Price moves down again. It reaches the lower boundary. Reaction appears again, but again, no extension. Now the bounce is weaker. Now the range compresses again. Now everything is tighter. Now the sequence accelerates. Reach the line. Fail. Return. Reach again. Fail faster. Return sooner. Now the structure is layered. Boundary below. Line above. Now price is trapped between them. Now the session confirms one thing. It is not free. It is controlled. Price moves again, but now the line starts to bend the move. The session forms at the boundary of the 120 line and prior compression range. Price opens near mid. It lifts immediately. This move is strong. It pushes through the prior upper boundary. It reaches the 120 again. This is the moment. If price passes here, space opens. If not, everything returns again. Price pushes through. For a moment, it stays. Now something changes. It holds briefly. Distance opens slightly. Now it looks different. But it cannot sustain. The moment weakens. Price stalls again. Now the return begins. Price drops back below the 120. It falls back inside the range. Now the break fails. Now the failure is larger. Before, failure was immediate. Now it is delayed, then collapses. Now define it clearly. Break above equals must hold. If it returns below, the entire move fails. Now the drop continues. Price moves down. It cuts through mid faster. It reaches lower half quickly. Now the reaction appears again. But again, no continuation. Now define the lower side again. Lower boundary equals reaction only. If reaction cannot extend, it fails again. Now the next push. Price lifts again. But now something is different. It reaches the 120 again, but slower. The move struggles. It pushes. It pauses. It barely moves through. Now the friction is stronger. Now the line is active. Now define the pressure. If price cannot move cleanly above the 120, it gets pulled back again. Now the drop. Price falls again. Now the return is faster than the push. Now the imbalance appears. Up moves slow. Down moves fast. Now the structure tilts. Now the next sequence. Price reaches up. Fails at the line. Returns quickly. Price reaches down. Reacts briefly. Fails again. Now both sides collapse. Now the entire range compresses again. Now execution becomes narrow. Now include the action frame. If price reaches above the 120, it must stay immediately. If not, it collapses back inside. If price drops below mid, it must continue immediately. If not, it returns again. Now both conditions fail repeatedly. Now nothing holds. Now the sequence accelerates again. Reach. Fail. Return. Reach again. Fail at the line. Return faster. Now the session confirms friction, not expansion, not trend. Friction. The line above. The boundary below. Price moves between them, but cannot escape. Price moves fast, but it cannot stay there. The session forms at the boundary of the 120 line and prior failed highs. Price opens near mid. It lifts immediately. This move is sharp. It breaks through the upper boundary. It pushes above the 120. For a moment it looks clean. It looks like it finally escapes, but it cannot stay. The move stalls above the line. It hesitates. It slows. Then it drops. Now the first failure appears. Price returns below the 120, back inside the range. Now the break is gone. Now define the line clearly. This is the execution line. If price cannot stay above the 120, it returns immediately. Now the drop accelerates. Price falls through mid faster than before. It reaches the lower half quickly. Now the reaction appears. But again, it cannot continue. Now define it directly. Lower reaction zone. If it cannot extend from here, it returns again. Now the bounce. It lifts. But the move is weak. It does not travel. It does not expand. It dies early. Now the entire structure compresses again. Now the next push. Price lifts again. It reaches the 120 again. But slower. It struggles to move through. It touches. It pauses. It barely moves. Now friction dominates. Now the failure comes earlier. It does not even clear properly. It turns. It drops again. Now define the pressure. Entry sits near the line. But holding fails. The moment it cannot stay, it collapses. Now the drop. Price moves down again. It reaches the lower boundary. Reaction appears again. But again, no continuation. Now the bounce is smaller. Now the entire range shrinks again. Now everything tightens again. Now the sequence becomes brutal. Reach the line. Fail. Return. Reach again. Fail faster. Return sooner. Now the structure punishes delay. Now timing becomes everything. If it does not hold immediately, it dies immediately. Now the next move. Price pushes up again. It looks usable, but it cannot stay. It fails instantly. Now the return is immediate. Now define the execution pain. Moves look clean, but they do not pay. Distance appears, but disappears faster. Now the session confirms one thing. You see movement, but you cannot keep it. Price moves again, but now everything slows at the top. The session forms at the boundary of the 120 line and repeated failure zone. Price opens near the upper half. It lifts slightly. It tests above. But now the move is different. It does not accelerate. It drags. It slows. Now friction is visible. Price moves above the 120, but it cannot extend. It stays briefly. Then it drops. Now the failure is slower but heavier. Now define it. Above the line equals must expand. If it slows, it fails. Now the drop. Price moves down. It cuts through mid again. Faster than the move up. Now imbalance increases. Up is slow. Down is fast. Now the structure tilts. Now the next push. Price lifts again. It reaches the same area. But now it struggles more. It cannot move freely. It crawls. It hesitates. Then fails. Now the upper side is blocked. Now the lower side. Price drops again. It reaches the lower boundary. Reaction appears. But again, no continuation. Now define the trap. Bounce looks usable, but it dies early. Now the range compresses further. Now the entire chart tightens. Now introduce the action frame directly. If price reaches above the 120, it must move immediately. If it slows, it fails. If price drops below mid, it must continue immediately. If it reacts, it returns again. Now both fail. Now nothing survives. Now repetition accelerates again. Reach, fail, return. Reach again. Fail slower, but still fail. Return deeper. Now the structure becomes exhausting. Moves look real, but they do not resolve. Now the next push. Price moves up again. It tests above. It tries to hold, but it cannot expand. Now the failure is confirmed again. Now the drop. Price moves down again. It reacts again. But again, no continuation. Now everything repeats. Now define the reality. You are inside friction. You are inside compression. You are inside failure. Now the session confirms it fully. Nothing holds. Nothing extends. Everything returns. Price moves again. But now distance disappears immediately. The session forms inside prior compression, directly under the 120 line. Price opens near mid. It lifts. The move looks clean. It pushes upward. It reaches the upper boundary again. It looks usable, but it slows. Before it reaches cleanly, it starts to stall. Now the first failure appears earlier. Price touches near the 120. It cannot pass. It hesitates. Then it drops. Now the return is faster than the approach. Now define it clearly. This is no longer a test. This is a rejection loop. If price cannot pass the 120 immediately, it returns faster than it arrived. Now the drop. Price moves down. It cuts through mid. It reaches the lower reaction zone. Now the bounce appears. It lifts. But it does not travel. It does not extend. It fails early. Now define the lower side. Reaction appears. But continuation fails again. Now both sides are collapsing inward. Now the next push. Price lifts again. It tries to reach the same level. But the distance is smaller. It fails before the line. Now failure happens before contact. Now the structure tightens further. Now define execution more directly. Upper attempt near the line. If it cannot break immediately, it fails instantly. Holding is not allowed. Now the next drop. Price falls again. It reaches the lower boundary. Reaction appears again. But again, no continuation. Now the bounce is even smaller. Now the range shrinks again. Now everything compresses again. Now the repetition becomes painful. Reach. Fail. Return. reach again. Fail earlier, return faster. Now the structure punishes hesitation. If you are late, you are already wrong. Now the next move. Price pushes up again. It looks like it might break, but it slows. It stalls. It fails. Now the return is immediate. Now define the action frame. Upper line equals failure trigger. If price slows here, it returns. Lower line equals reaction only. If bounce is weak, it fails again. Mid equals collapse point. Everything comes back here. Now the sequence continues. Price moves up, fails early, returns fast. Price moves down, reacts briefly, fails again. Now nothing holds. Now nothing extends. Now the session confirms one thing. You are inside a loop, and the loop is tightening. Price moves again, but now even movement becomes unreliable. The session forms at the boundary of compressed highs and the 120 line pressing down. Price opens near upper half. It lifts. It pushes into the upper zone again. This is the test. If it breaks and holds, distance opens. If it slows, it fails again. Price pushes above. For a moment, it holds. This is different. This is the first delay. Now distance opens slightly. Now it looks real. But it cannot sustain. The move stalls. The push weakens. Now the failure begins. Price drops back below the level. Now the entire move collapses. Now define it clearly. Break must hold. If it returns, the whole move is invalid. Now the drop accelerates. Price falls through mid faster than before. It reaches lower half quickly. Now reaction appears again. But again, no continuation. Now define the lower side again. Reaction appears. But if it does not extend immediately, it fails again. Now the bounce. It lifts slightly, then stops, then drops again. Now the range compresses further. Now everything tightens again. Now the next push. Price lifts again. It tries to reach the upper zone, but it struggles. It slows earlier. It cannot move freely. Now friction dominates fully. Now the line controls the move. Now define the pressure. If price cannot move cleanly above the 120, it gets rejected again. Now the drop. Price falls again. Now the return is faster than the push. Now imbalance is extreme. Up moves weak. Down moves sharp. Now the structure tilts further. Now the repetition continues. Reach the line. Fail. Return. Reach again. Fail slower, but still fail. Return deeper. Now the chart becomes exhausting. Moves appear, but nothing resolves. Now the final push in this session. Price moves up again. It tests above. It tries to hold, but it slows. Now failure is confirmed again. Now the drop. Price moves down again. Reaction appears again. But again, no continuation. Now everything repeats again. Now define the condition. If price moves, it must hold. If it cannot hold, it returns faster than before. Now nothing satisfies the condition. Now nothing survives. Now the session confirms one thing. Not breakout. Not trend. Failure. Price moves, but it does not leave. The structure forms inside higher time frame containment. Look at the weekly. Price drops. It looks like a break, but it cannot stay below. It returns immediately. Now the first contradiction appears. Break happens, but location does not change. Now the weekly repeats. Price pushes again. It reaches the lower zone. It hesitates. It fails. It returns. Now distance disappears again. Now the monthly. Price falls from the upper range. It looks like continuation, but it cannot hold. It drops. Then it stops. Then it comes back. Now the monthly confirms. Move exists, but holding fails. Now define the structure. The monthly forms inside the prior range. The weekly forms inside the monthly. The daily rotates inside the weekly. Now everything is nested. Now nothing is free. Now go back to what you saw before. Every move tried to expand. Every move failed. Every move returned. Now the reason is visible. There is no higher time frame support. Now the pressure begins. If price cannot stay on the weekly, it returns inside the monthly. If price cannot stay on the daily, it returns inside the weekly. Now every move is limited before it starts. Now execution changes. A move begins. It looks clean, but if it does not hold immediately, it collapses. Now the second sequence. Price reaches mid. It pauses. It fails. It drops again. Now mid is not support. Mid is where moves die. Now the entire structure shifts. Not directional. Not trending. It is restrictive. Now the key change. Distance becomes shorter. Reactions come faster. Continuation fails earlier. Now everything accelerates inward. Now nothing expands. Now the system compresses across time frames. Now the weekly cannot escape. Now the monthly cannot release. Now the daily is trapped inside both. Now define the condition. If higher time frame cannot open space, lower time frame cannot survive movement. Now go back again. All those failures, all those fast returns, all those early reversals, they were not mistakes. They were structure. Now the system is aligned, not for movement, for restriction. Now the final pressure builds, not outside, inside. Price moves again, but now nothing survives. The structure forms at the boundary of full compression. Now the daily. Price lifts. It moves toward the upper boundary. It looks like expansion, but the pattern is already known. If it cannot stay, it returns. Price reaches the upper zone. It touches. It stalls. It fails instantly. Now the drop. Price falls back inside. Faster than before. Now define it clearly. Break happens. Holding fails. Return accelerates. Now the lower side. Price drops. It reaches the lower boundary. Reaction appears. But it does not extend. It dies early. Now both sides confirm. Upper cannot hold. Lower cannot continue. Now the range locks completely. Now the next sequence. Price moves again. But now the distance is smaller. It reaches faster. Fails faster. Returns faster. Now timing collapses. Now execution tightens. If price moves up, it must hold immediately. If not, it collapses instantly. If price moves down, it must continue immediately. If not, it snaps back. Now both conditions fail again. Now nothing survives. Now repetition becomes aggressive. Reach, fail, return. Again, reach, fail faster. Return sooner. Now the chart becomes crowded. Moves exist, but space disappears. Now define the real condition. There is no room. There is no delay. There is no tolerance. Now execution is no longer about direction. It is about timing. Now the pressure increases again. A move starts. It looks clean. But if you hesitate, distance is already gone. A move fails. It looks small. But if you hold, loss expands immediately. Now nothing forgives. Now everything reacts. Now the structure is not giving opportunity. It is forcing decisions. Now the final collapse. Moves start strong, but die instantly. Pullbacks deepen, but stop early. Continuation fails everywhere. Now the entire system compresses into one thing. Timing. Faster. Shorter. Earlier. Now everything repeats. But faster. Now everything fails. But earlier. Now everything returns. But closer. Now the system is complete, but not released. No breakout. No expansion. No resolution. Only tightening. Only pressure. Only repetition. Now the entire structure is waiting, but not for direction. For release. But if it comes, it will not wait. Environment is still processing.